Hello, Dr. James Bogash, expert in health and longevity and creator of Bogash Life and Balance. And today we're going to talk about vitamin D, which certainly I've covered many times in the past, but just to drive the point home about how important it is to make sure that your vitamin D levels are optimal and how we can get there. But we should probably start by saying, like, by now everybody has an idea that vitamin D deficiency is a problem, and that it's quite common. If you aren't aware of that, you've probably been living in a cave, which would pretty much guarantee that you are deficient in vitamin D, especially if you never come out of the cave. But the challenge is that vitamin D is not actually a vitamin. It's a hormone. So vitamins are used as cofactors to make sure enzymes do their job. So think like vitamin B12, vitamin C. They help an enzyme work either more efficiently or just work at all. But vitamin hormones actually change the way they sit on DNA, and they change the way a cell functions, and that's what vitamin D does. It's actually a hormone, not a vitamin. So imagine if you were deficient in insulin, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, like there'd be problems. And it's no different with vitamin D. The challenge then is there's a lot of hype with vitamin D. And there's some things that vitamin D does very well, and there's some things that vitamin D is more hype. It's not going to really make that much of a difference with cardiovascular, with heart issues or stroke issues, maybe a little bit. So if you see a study looking at vitamin D in heart and saying, oh, it doesn't work, well, that's a study that was designed to fail. However, looking at things like bone health, immune function, cancer, those are all things where vitamin D probably plays a very important role. So most people, like, as far as where we're going to get our vitamin D from, it's not going to happen from foods. You're not going to be drinking vitamin D fortified milk. You could argue that we shouldn't be drinking milk anyway. I'm generally not a fan of dairy. So generally, our ancestors got it from sunlight. And we didn't have sunscreen. We weren't sitting in playing video games in the middle of the day. We were designed for high levels of sun exposure. And granted, it was at our geographical latitude, so like my Irish ancestors were not hanging out at the equator, but they were outside all year long getting exposed to sunlight and generating their own vitamin D. Today, however, we have challenges. First of all, we seem to think that we need to slap on SPF 80 to walk to the car. So sunscreen use is quite appropriately, inappropriately used too often in the wrong scenarios. I myself will really rarely use sunscreen unless I'm going to be out in the sun for more than an hour or so. If you've got more sensitive skin, like, you'd need to take that into account. But air pollution plays a role in how much UVB strikes our skin and produces vitamin D, vitamin D. We have obesity is an issue, skin color, time of day. There's a lot of factors that play a role. And in today's society across the globe, vitamin D deficiency is considered a pandemic. And I use that word because most people it doesn't mean what it thinks that people use that word, but it doesn't mean what they think that it means. But vitamin D is yet another pandemic that we're not terribly worried about. And to drive it home, this was a study done in southern Italy on almost 1,500 kids, kids being from like 2 months old to 18 or so. And they found that 80% of them were insufficient, meaning they used 30 nanograms per deciliter, which 30 is just bottom line. So we're not even talking about optimal. We're talking about really deficient or not sufficient. 80% of the kids, this included the summer. So these kids are probably not getting the sun exposure that they were designed for. You look at darker skin, that all plays a role. And that always boils back down to supplementation. So supplementation, this doesn't Taking supplements doesn't alleviate your need to get out in the sun, because there are things that sunlight does that don't involve vitamin D, like nitric oxide production and mood. So we need sunlight exposure. We can't just take vitamin D instead of. But you can certainly cut down your sunlight exposure with vitamin D supplementation. Myself, I take 6,000 a day, and I have what I call rational sun exposure. So I'm not lying out at the pool here in Phoenix in August at noon with baby oil with iodine in it. But generally, if I'm driving around my slingshot, which gives me nice sun exposure, especially in the arm and face, depending upon time of day, there's no way I'd consider wearing sunscreen for that period of time. Another quick mention about checking vitamin D levels. I myself rarely check somebody's vitamin D levels. There's only a couple specific situations that I would. So I typically say that if your doctor is checking your vitamin D levels, it may mean that they're not that current on the medical literature, because the researchers 15 years ago were saying, listen, everybody's deficient, it's very inexpensive, you can supplement for years for what a single blood test for vitamin D costs. And the safety window is so large. It's difficult to overdose unless you actually make a determined effort to overdose. So as always, I'll post a link to this particular study in the comment section, or I'm sorry, in the description. Make sure you like this video, share it with somebody who you think needs the information, and subscribe to the channel.